Okay, we're going to be learning the Rebbe's talk of Parshas Vayikra in the year Tafshin Lamed Beis 1972. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is Sicho Parshas Vayikra, the third of Nisan Tafshin Lamed Beis 1972. So the Rebbe says, Kvoi Kedushas Admir Shlita Kiddush Al Yayin. The Rebbe made Kiddush on wine as he started the Fabring, and that was the custom. The Rebbe started to say the Sicha like this. Haschola v'Hashem shel Parshas Hashavua. What is the beginning and the name of this week's Parsha is Vayikra, which means that he was called, Moshe was called. Higam ha'aschola v'Hashem shel Sefer Shalom b'Torah. It's not just the name of this week's Parsha, it's also the name of the entire book of Vayikra. It's called Vayikra. It's one of it's the third and one from the most essential of the 5 books because it deals with all the laws. As we find the Medrash explains, to the 5 times it says Oira, Shabbos Cholas HaTorah, which says that there was light when God created the world. Shem Keneged Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The 5 times it talks about light corresponds to the 5 books of the Torah. Vayara Likimis Orki Toiv. And when it says God saw the light and the light was good, Keneged Sefer Vayikra. That corresponds to the book of Vayikra. So that this light is good is referring to the 3rd book of Chumash, which is Vayikra. Shu Malei Halachis Rabbis, because it's full of so many laws. Just starting on page 470. So it's full of laws. Therefore, the book is called Vayikra. So the book of Vayikra is the one of the unique of the 5 books of Moshe. Okay, the Isa b'Gemara b'Maseches Brachas, as the Talmud says in Brachas, a Pirush HaPasuk that it talks about the verse in Shmuel. I think it's talking about Yehoidio, V'hu Yored V'hika Sa'ari, hit the lion V'toich Habar into the pit b'Yom HaShalag on a day of snow. The Tanya. That was Sifra de Rav. We learned in the Sifra of the Yeshiva of Rav that Torah's Karnim, it's referring to Torah's Karnim, Mehari Darish Shehu Chomer Shebisfarim, because it's the most severe of the 5 books, again with all the laws. V'hu be'emsa hasfarim, and it's the middle of the books. So the middle means it's the first 2 books to the beginning and the second 2 books at the end. The middle book is the book of Vayikra, which is B'toch Habar. That's why it's the middle of the pit, meaning to say it's protected by the other sides. As we explained many times how we understand the names of the parshas. Because the custom by Jewish people is to refer to a certain parsha by a name, and a custom by the Jewish people makes it Torah. That means that the actual name is not just a name that happened to be that the Jewish people called this week's parsha. Torah accepts that this is the name of this week's parsha. Obviously, the Rebbe is going into to understand what is the significance of the word Vayikra. It's not just any name, but it's a name that shows us at the depth, the point of what is the message of the parsha. So it's not just also not just the name itself, but the first subject of the parsha gives us an understanding of the whole parsha. We know, like the first letters, that sometimes you have a Rashi Tevis, the first letters of a word, also in certain halachic aspects, also is significant. What are the first letters of a word? So too, this first idea of a parsha is significant. So we must conclude that the name Vayikra, it's significant to give us insight on the book and on the parsha and on the book of Vayikra. That's why we call the name of the parsha and the name of the whole sefer Vayikra. Okay. And again, the significance that it's not just any of the 5 books, but it's the 3rd book. The middle, Vatichoni, and it's a fundamental book because of all the laws. Hashem Vayikra Gama Toichin. Shakol Chamisha Chmusha Torah. We have to say that the name Vayikra, if it's the name that we give to the whole Sefer, and the Sefer Vayikra is the Toichin, is one of the essential messages of the Torah. So the name Vayikra carries within it the essential message of the entire Torah, not just the book of Vayikra. We could find if we analyze properly and understand the significance in the word, we could see the message of the entire Torah in the word of Vayikra. And not just the 5 books of Torah, Chamisha Chumoshe Torah, we could even the oral law find the whole idea of what Torah is in the name Vayikra. Okay, so it carries a big responsibility. Because the oral Torah is founded in the written Torah, and if the written Torah is all based on the idea of Vayikra, so that means that the oral Torah is also based on the idea of Vayikra. Kalashon Haraga, like the Gemara many times says, how do we know? How do we know a certain law? So the Gemara will ask, how do you know a law? How do you know such a law? So the Gemara says, the Amar Kra, because there's a verse. There's a verse to support this idea. Hello, Reb Shem, on page 417. There's some sort of hint or indication. The and so the Rebbe says that in Torah Shebeksav, the ideas of Torah are more clear, meaning to say that we see clearly this is Torah. There's hints from the verses to teach us laws, but the whole point is that the name, again, what the Rebbe is getting at is the name Vayikra is the first letter and the name that we call the beginning of the Parsha. Also, the whole Sefer is called Vayikra. The book of Vayikra is the third of the books, and it's the most fundamental book. It has all the laws in it. Therefore, it sort of say carries within it the whole point of Torah. So if you want to know what is the point of Torah Shebeksav, the written Torah, and the oral Torah, the whole Nakud of Torah is in the word Vayikra. So we see the significance in the word Vayikra. We have to understand what that is. So that's why the Rebbe adds that Sefer Vayikra Nikal Pi Minig Yisrael Gam Hashem Sefer Karbanos. There's another name that we give to the book, the third book of Chumash, which we know as Vayikra, and that is called the book of sacrifices. The Nachmanides mentions that. That's called the Book of Sacrifices. And the Rebbe says, who's the Ramban? Meaning, what's his significance? One of the most essential commentaries on the Talmud, on the Chumash, and then Makubal, we know the Ramban was a Makubal, a Kabbalist. He was very reliable. In his preview to Vayikra, he says that Vayikra is also called the Book of Sacrifices. So if we're saying that the book of Vayikra is the third book, and it carries within it, based on what we've taught before, the essentials of the entire Torah. So there's also the message of the book of Karbanos that carries within it the message of Torah. Okay, in this Fabrengen, I happen to learn the Maimra in that the Rebbe said in this Fabrengen. It's based on this idea. We're trying to figure out how do we combine the power of Torah with the power of Karban, of sacrifice. But the name Vayikra is more essential and more telling of the message of Vayikra, and therefore the message of Torah, than the name, the book of sacrifices. Why? It doesn't say anywhere that Vayikra is called Sefer Karbanos. It's not like there's a word that we could use to, or words that we could use to. It's just an idea. The idea is that it's a book of sacrifices. So number one is Kashem Vayikra Inyan Shemafurish Begali, but the name Vayikra does say clearly. If you were to ask someone who doesn't understand what they're reading, could read words, but doesn't understand the meaning of the words, so that person couldn't give you the idea and tell you that the book is called the Book of Sacrifices, because that person, he or she, doesn't understand what they're reading, so they can't give it a name to the idea. But they could tell you it's called Vayikra. Why? Because that's the first word, and they could read the first word. So ki is Hashem Vayikra. So hey, then the name Vayikra is clear even for a person who doesn't know what it means. Who amnam lo yadam amunach b'amira. He doesn't know what the word Vayikra does mean. He knows that is the word, and that's enough to know that the book of Vayikra is called Vayikra. we know that the rule is that when one reads the written Torah, even if you do not know the meaning of the words, and the reason you don't know the meaning of the words is because you're simple, and we haven't been educated to know the meaning of the Hebrew words. Nevertheless, you fulfill the mitzvah of studying Torah. Even a person, we don't measure a person's scholarly skills in order for them to be able to make the blessing on Torah. But every morning we have the blessing of Torah. We make the blessing of Torah on the words of Torah. Even if the person's so simple, they can't understand any ideas of Torah. Nevertheless, mevarach birchas haTorah b'shachar in the morning, before they say the verses of Torah. So too, if you were to call up a person who doesn't even know the meanings of the words, but can stand there and listen to the words of Torah, can make a bracha. But it's not so is the rule in the oral Torah. If a person opens up the oral Torah and just reads the words without understanding the laws and the meaning, you're not yotze limud Torah. You're not fulfilling your obligation of studying Torah. It's not considered studying Torah. If you don't understand what you're reading, it's not considered studying. That's the fundamental difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah. The written Torah, if you read the words, you're considered studying Torah, even if you don't understand the words. That's how powerful the words of Torah are in the written Torah, but that doesn't apply to the oral Torah, to the laws, to the Talmud, to the Mishnah. V'ilo Hashem Sefer Kabbanis, therefore the name to call the book of Vayikra, the book of sacrifices. Any Inyan Shinroim Bigoli B'Haschalas Sefer. The person who's, let's say, simple, wouldn't know that that's called the book of sacrifices because he doesn't know what the book is talking about. One has to first understand the content of the book and then to label it as saying, oh, well, this is the book of sacrifices. And only after one studies it, if you understand it, then you can know that's called the book of sacrifices. That's why we name it the name of the book of sacrifices. But nevertheless, it's not as obvious as the name Vayikra. And this difference that we have in the names of Sefer Vayikra or Sefer Karbanis, the name of calling it Vayikra, calling it the Book of Sacrifices. It's not just a difference because that depending on who the person is, but that's the way it really is. The name Vayikra is more essential than the name of the Book of Sacrifices. This idea that Torah is understood with the concept of Vayikra is more clear than calling the book Sefer HaKabbanis. We still don't know what the Rebbe means to say. I mean, the Rebbe is going to teach us that in the word of Vayikra, in the message of Vayikra, of the opening verse of the pasuk of this week's parsha and of the book of Vayikra, is the essential message of Torah. So V'achilik ben Beis again, V'achilik ben Beis Hashem is B'negei Ish Yisrael Lamata, U'b'gal Shekein Al Mitase Shel Davar. This difference, that if a person knows the name is Vayikra or understands the name is the book of sacrifices, because that's really an essential difference. The connection to Torah, to Vayikra is obvious. It's so obvious that it comes down to this world. That's connected to the written Torah. By writing something, that's the action. The oral Torah is only through speech, not through writing. It's not even though we say that when a person moves their lips, that's an action, but it's not as great as an action as writing. Even for the person who doesn't know what it says, but to say that the Torah is connected to the idea of sacrifices, that's a hidden idea. It's not as revealed as the idea of Vayikra. To understand the concept of sacrifices within Torah it requires more understanding to understand the concept of Vayikra in Torah. Okay, let's see what the Rebbe means to say. We have to understand now. What does it mean that the name Vayikra, again, Vayikra means that God called Moshe. It doesn't say God, it says that Moshe was called. Vayikra Moshe, Moshe was called. Or the name of the book, calling it the book of sacrifices. So what's the calling have to do with the idea of Torah or the book of sacrifices? So the Rebbe says like this, so we'll understand this all. Famous question, the Alter Rebbe asked it in the Likutei Torah, asked in many places. Why does the Torah not say who's calling Moshe? The Torah should have maybe said, Vayikra Hashem el Moshe, God called Moshe. But the Torah doesn't say that. It omits the name God. It says Vayikra Moshe. Moshe was called. It doesn't say who's calling him. The Rebbe says, She'ein zeh k'moi b'Megillah. We know the concept that in the Megillah Esther, right? That Shalai Niskish Moshe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Although God is in the entire story, it's all miraculous. But nowhere in the book of the Sefer of Vayikra are you going to find, the book of Megillah, are you going to find the name of God? Because the name of God is hidden in the Megillah. In the Megillah, we don't have God's name written there, even though he's there, but he's not written in the Megillah. We don't find the name. Because you can't say that that's what it means over here, that it really means God, but we just try to conceal it, because then right afterwards, the verse continues, and God spoke to him. So obviously, we're not trying to hide the name of God, so why can't we just mention the name of God? Vaf became an again Vayikra. When it comes to who's calling, Leinis Farish doesn't explain Mihu Akayra, who's calling. So the Torah starts off, it says Vayikra El Moshe V'Daber Hashem Elav. God called Moshe. But it doesn't say God. It says that Moshe was called and God spoke to him. Why doesn't it say and God called Moshe? So the idea explained is Vayikra Stam. The reason why the Torah doesn't say who's calling, just says that Moshe was called. V'lei Nemer Mihu Akayra. Doesn't say who's the one who's calling. Is Harizah the fish Zui Kriya Mimchin Shleman L'Shemis. Is because this is the Hasidic concept. This is very much, this opening talk is almost like a mimer. It's a very Hasidic idea. Because it's talking about the level of God that's beyond name. When we give God a name, we know that in Chassidus we've learned many times, the name is already distant from the essence. You know, an essential person on their own doesn't need a name. A name is only required for someone else to know who's talking, who said that. So you say a name, so we know who said that. But the person on their own doesn't need a name. You don't need a name to exist. So if you get rid of the name, so to say, it's more essential. So the idea that Vayikra El Moshe was called, is to be beyond the name. The level of God calling, communicating with Moshe is so deep, that's beyond even the name of God. Ani hu HaKoira, I'm the one calling, without giving the name. What does that mean? The level that God called Moshe doesn't come from a level of godliness. That the world was created. We know the name Yudke Vavke, Havaya, means creator. That's the name that defines God as a creator. The calling of Moshe into the Mishkan on the 8th day of the dedication of the Mishkan was not coming from the name of God as a creator. That the creator, part of his message of creating and his plan of creating, is now to communicate with Moshe, to continue with this mission of creation. No, it's a part of God that's deeper than the creator. The calling towards Moshe, and we're going to learn soon, the Rebbe says this calling is to every person. This is the calling that God calls to each and every one of us that's beyond the creator of God. It's not the level of God as he created the world. If you want to say who's God, what is God? Like what is so great about God that he created the world? That's not who God is. That's not the ikr. You can't say that. What's the definition of God? That he's a creator. The calling comes from the essence of God. Therefore, we don't mention a name. Don't know me by this name now. His name is distant. The calling is so deep and so connected that's without defining by name. Kisham hu ha'arabavad. Because the name Kishem Sari hu ha'arabavad, a name is only a ray of the essence. V'ilu kan, but it comes to this communication, the Moshe, God calls Moshe, Hakriya He mitzad etzem, it's coming from the essence of God. So now we're starting to see what the Rebbe means, that the name Vayikra is the essence of Torah. The name Vayikra represents the essential connection beyond even God being a creator. V'ilu kan hakriya mitzad etzem, shezui bechinas d'lai itfes v'lai isrames b'shum ois v'koitz, the level of godliness that can't even be hinted or captured in any kind of hint or letter or indication of the letter. Surely it's greater than any name. And because this calling of Moshe comes from the essence of above, what's the point of it? What's the point when we say that that God, Vayikra Moshe, the essence of God called Moshe? Not just saying that the name of God, so to say, as a creator called Moshe. It's not just to show the level of where God is when he's calling Moshe. But what the Rebbe says, Harizim Oyer, it awakens within the person who's being called. You're being called beyond the name. Your relationship is beyond the title. As the nemt, it wakens up the person in response to that closeness. As Etzem and Hashem Mamish, their essence. Why would God call me so deep? Because my connection isn't just that God has a plan and I'm the person who fulfills that plan or gets the plan done. It's deeper than that. And what's deeper? Because I have an essential connection to God that's also beyond the plan, beyond the purpose of creation. And that gets awoken when I get such a calling from God. When Moshe gets such a calling from God, again, God, the Rebbe is going to explain this is to every person. That awakens the essence of who they are, that's beyond even the name. The Rebbe says, wow, the Rebbe says not just greater than the three conscious levels of the soul, which are the nefesh, ruach, neshama, but even higher than the level of Chai Yechida. Shehem Hashem is Shnikla. These are all names, even the highest level of the neshama. The Yechida, which comes from the word Yachid, the essential part of the soul, it's still a name. It's a connection to the spark of Creator. That's even higher than the highest level that's within the soul. That calling that God called Moshe, and through that to every person, is a relationship, is a calling, is a sign of connection that's beyond any title that the Jewish person has, because it's coming from a place that has no title by God Himself. It's like a person goes to a show, right? Everyone has to wear a name tag, where you come from, what you do, your name. Right away, that's a good thing, right? Because that's people know who you are. But that right away makes it all about the name tag. The only thing that's important was what's on the name tag, what company you work for, and what's your job, and what's your name. There's nothing to do who I am. The point of this conference is not to get to know who I am as a person. It's what I represent. I'm a representative of a company that has an idea and has an interest, etc., etc. And we keep it at that. That's a distance. So it says, it's so deep. To the spark of Creator, that's even higher than the essence of the soul. Meaning to say the Yechida, the highest level of the name. So even, like it says like this, even if you call him by his name, it's not just a part of the name. It means, for instance, you have a title and you have a name, because it doesn't say Vayikra a love. Then it says Vayikra Moshe. Moshe, that's a name, right? But we're talking about the name that doesn't represent an idea, or a job, like he called the doctor. He called the name of the person, and that name is a representation of the essence of the person. Even if you mention the name, you mention the name. But it's not the intention. It's not any detail. The essence of the person. When you call someone by their name, and it's the point is not the name, because the whole person turns. The Rebbe said in Yiddish, one essence is calling another essence. So one essence is calling another essence. Therefore, we don't mention God's name because we know who's talking. But we don't mention it because we're trying to indicate that it's an etzem. It's an essence calling out to another essence. This is what it means. Vayikra. Here he says, before we even say the name Moshe, therefore it says, we could just pause at the word Vayikra. There's been a calling. There's been a calling of one essence to another essence, the essence of God to the essence of the person, in this case Moshe, but also the Moshe within every person. But therefore we could stop at the Vayikra even before we say El Moshe, the two Moshe. Because this calling is not just to Moshe. This is a calling to every single Jewish person. Even a Jewish person who never heard of Moses, never heard of Moshe. Who's Moshe? From the 7 the most prominent of the 7 shepherds of the Jewish people. And every Jewish person has a part of Moshe within them, as it's brought down. But though the person doesn't know of Moshe, the ability to have this calling and this connection comes because of Moshe's elevating each person to have that essence. But nevertheless, although Moshe is maybe the hidden operator within this person, doesn't require the person to know of Moshe's connection or his connection to Moshe, to have that calling from the essence of God to their essence. Even to the person who doesn't recognize Moshe and doesn't recognize the importance to Moshe in his own life or her own life. Nevertheless, a love magia, even to him or her comes this calling from the essence of God that's beyond the name, and it penetrates through to your essence. Now we understand what the Rebbe says, why the name Vayikra is the essence of the Torah, not just the essence of the parsha, not just the essence of the book of Vayikra, but because it's the central book, it's a third of the 5 books, the middle book, so to say, in the bar, in the pit, like it says, B'yom HaSheleg, that's the message, the essential message of what Torah is. Rabbeinu Zaken Mevar b'Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, when a person studies Torah, the hamshacha, the flow of light, of revelation that you bring down is called b'lashon kriya. It says called asher yikra'u be'emes, right? En kriya ela b'Torah. We find many times the expression of kriya, vayikra, calling out. The idea of bringing down through Torah is called kriya satorah. Koyer b'Torah, someone who calls Torah. Why do we say koyer b'Torah? Someone who calls Torah. We know the Torah is called mikra. What's it mean, mikra? What's the word vayikra? What's the source here? Because what's happening is, when a person studies Torah, this is the message. This is what Hashem's telling Moshe and revealing this to the Jewish people. That what does it mean to study Torah? If the book of Vayikra is the essence of Torah, the essence of all the Torah, you have to know. When a person studies Torah, just like God called Moshe, you're calling God. You're calling God to come to you. And you're not calling him by name, you're calling him essence to essence. Like a person who were to call their friend, Shiyav have to come to them. Like a young child, to call the father to come to him. When a young child screaming for his father or her father, that's like Vayikra. When someone studies Torah, that's calling God towards them. The Rebbe explains. When 2 people call each other that are within range, means the people are, so to say, equal. Is he kriya shekashuri mavanav asag? So what's the basis of the calling? The Rebbe is getting at is what's that in calling could be so deep, it doesn't require that there should be a level of equality between the caller and the person being called. Because when 2 people are pretty much equal, so the connection is based on understanding. We understand things similarly, we like things similar. It's based on avar vasar, based on understanding. Hey, Ariel. And but when a child calls the father, it's not because the son has an equal understanding to the father. We're not talking about any child, but an infant, a young child. We know that the first thing a child learns once he eats or she eats grains is to call their father, call to their parents. It's not because there's some great understanding between the caller and the one who's being called, and not even a great understanding from the one who's calling, from the katan, what it means to be a father. Basic on it's like a certain instinct that the child has. You can't compare the level. There's no comparison between the level of comprehension of the father and the young child. What's happening? Why does the father respond specifically to his child calling him? Is because it's his child and it's an essential connection. And when something is essentially connected to you, it's not because this child is talented or understanding. We share things, common interest. It's my son calling me. End of story. That's an essential connection. And when one calls to God, just like an infant calls to his father, that when you try to call out to God based on God, let's have a conversation. I understand things. You understand things. Let's come to agreement. You're distancing yourself from God. But if you call to God like a child, the simplicity of a child calling to its father, the essence to essence. So the way you measure your relationship to God, God responds. Then God responds to call from his essence back to you. A lot of times children have a conversation. It depends what's the basis of the conversation. If you're trying to have a logical conversation, then the father automatically reserves up and it becomes a logical conversation. When the kid starts crying from the essence, it's nothing to do with words. It's nothing to do if it makes sense or not. It doesn't have to make sense. It's a son calling a father. Vayikra stam, and then we see the Torah says that Moshe was called. Vayikra, it doesn't say who called him, because it shows that this is an essential connection. It's not about why, it's not about who. It's the who's only based on the fact that this is my son calling me. When he's moving, the Rebbe says this is understood. From this is understood. So if we're saying that the midah, the measurement of how a Jew has to be, is to be like a son, a young son, without a logical reason, just because you're essentially connected, calls the father. So therefore, when we open the book Vayikra, and we see Vayikra stop, and then of course El Moshe, but there was a calling. Like the Rebbe says, a calling to every single Jew, even a Jew who doesn't know of who Moshe is. So they have to say that also it's like a father calling to a small child, which is not a logical calling from the father's side. This is the essence. Why is the father called? The name Av is defined by an essential connection between this person and this child. You don't say thank you for calling me. What do you mean thank you? Thank you is as if there's an option for something else. What makes you a father? Is because you have a son. You only become a father if you have a child. This is even higher than the connection that the Medrash quotes on the verse, V'hine Hashem nitzav olav, God stands over each individual. That the righteous, but again, righteous means that they've earned it through actions, through being righteous. His God is over them, like the chariot, that the rider through the chariot gets to a place that the rider couldn't get there on his own. This is just going even higher. The Rebbe says when you have a connection of V'hine Hashem nitzav olav, that God, so to say, rides by the chariot of the righteous, and he gets elevated through the righteous to a higher place. That's just a higher level of revelation, elevation, however you want to look at it. But here it's not a question of higher or lower. When we say God is of a Rachaman, a compassionate father, what makes him a father is because we're a child. He's dependent on the child to be a father. The idea is like this. And we're saying an amazing thing about Torah. That when one calls Torah, you could call Torah like a young child calls a father. So the Rebbe says, what is it? Where did we find? Why is that? Why is Torah so deep? Why is that such a deep connection represented by Torah? So the Rebbe explains. What is Torah? Not the logic, the depth, understanding, the intellect of Torah. The intellect and comprehension aspect of Torah. The Torah testifies to that idea. That the Torah itself is the chachma, the wisdom, and understanding to all the nations. That's only the way Torah encloses itself. What the Rebbe is getting at. It's just like the father doesn't have. If the father wasn't, you could have all the components of a father, but if this is not your son, and we know that as we have people that let's say, there's methods that people try to have a connection that may not have that essential connection. When you have Torah, And Torah is, because it's a wisdom, and I'm understanding God's wisdom, it's still not the essence. The essence is the Torah is beyond wisdom, beyond understanding, beyond the comprehension. The God encloses himself in Seichel. That's one of the ways for us to grasp him, through the understanding of Torah. But it's not that the Torah is defined by the Seichel, by the intellect of Torah. It's really a much deeper central idea that's just brought down into the Seichel, into the intellect. Because he says like this, this is only how Torah encloses itself into intellect. And you could grab Torah through your understanding. But that's still not the essence. But therefore, because there's something deeper than that, so therefore, just like the person himself is not defined by their seichel, right? You're not alive because you have comprehension. You're not alive because you have wisdom. You're alive because you're chayes atzmi. You have an essential life. That's who you are. Your life is not dependent. Your being is not dependent on your intellect. But your being is, you use your intellect as a method to connect. So too, God is not defined by the intellect of Torah. There's an essence that encloses itself in wisdom, and our essence encloses itself in our wisdom, and therefore we connect in a pneumistic way. We connect through our seichel, but what's really happening is a connection between two essence, and that's why Vayikra. That's the whole point of Vayikra. That's what Torah is telling us. Don't stop at the intellect of Torah. What's really happening over here is your essence is calling to God's essence, and God's essence is calling to your essence. And it happens through the wisdom of Torah. But that's just a levush, that's just a garment. And therefore we're able to take the Torah through our intellect. But what's the real essence and the real point of Torah? It's not the intellect of Seichel. It's the essence of God. Like God said, my essence, my soul, nafshi kasavis yahavis, I put into Torah. And that's not the intellect of Torah. That's the essence of Torah. We could do a piskim of Baal Shem Tov, as the Baal Shem Tov has said, Shemei Vinechli, that the grandson of Baal Shem Tov taught us in his book, Degel Machna Ephraim. Shekaviyachol nafshi shakadish baruch hu mamish b'Torah. God's soul is mamish in Torah. It's actually in Torah. And therefore, when you study Torah, it's not you're getting God's wisdom. Because he encloses himself in that wisdom, is oisiatem leichim, you're taking the essence of God. Which is much higher than intellectual relationship and grasping of God. Therefore, the law is, like we said before, that if a person doesn't have intellect, doesn't have the ability to understand, it doesn't mean that you can't have a connection to Torah and God through Torah. You could say the words of Torah, you don't even know what you're saying. So you have no intellectual connection there. Nevertheless, but your essence, which is taking the essence of God, takes it even though you're just reading words that you don't understand. Because reading the words, these are the words of Torah, and in these words is an etzem, is an essence, and your essence is reading these words. You take the level of the unknown. Like it says, the head, that you don't know, and it's not to be known. Not only don't you know, it can't be known. He himself doesn't understand how deep is in there. And it brings it down even to the person who literally doesn't know. So the Rebbe says that you're able to reach the level of the unknown of God that's beyond knowing or beyond even able to know, into the person who simply doesn't understand because you said the words of Torah. This is two extremes of the spectrum. The highest level of the unknown. Like the Rabbi Yochanan Zaki says, although the Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, saved Judaism after the destruction of the temple, he still said, I don't know, because I can't reach past the known of what way I'm going to be taken. It reaches all the way down to the unknown simply. The person who just doesn't know anything. You don't even know what you're saying. Because even in your unknowing, your simplicity of knowledge, of lack of knowledge, but it's still connected to the unknown of God. Because Torah is not defined by the intellect of Torah, but by the essence that's enclosed in the intellect of Torah. Therefore, we find by Purim, it says about Purim that on the holiday of Purim, the Jewish people reconnected to the Torah on the level that's even greater than Matan Torah. They confirmed and reaffirmed their connection to Torah. They completed what they started in Matan Torah. How do you celebrate what the Jewish people accomplished on Purim, which is that they completed the accepting of Torah? It's not through opening up. We would think if it's completing of studying of Torah, open up a sefer and learn the whole day. No, it's about reaching a level of not knowing. Right, the person has to reach ad lo yada, because what's really happening when someone's studying Torah is to connect to the unknown that's only enclosed in the known. And how do you do that? By getting out of your own known, out of your own sechel, out of your yada, of your knowing. The close in that the Rebbe says like this. What does this all mean? When a person studies Torah, you have to know it's not just you're studying an idea, a knowledge, a law. Miskasher ha'etzem shal Yehudi, ha'etzem shal Kadosh Baruch Hu. The essence of the Jew connects with the essence of God. Ad shenasim kul echad, it becomes one. Ukediv Rabbeinu Azakim Tanya, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Shaydei limda Torah, when a person studies Torah, nasa yichud nifla, it becomes an amazing oneness. She'ein yichud k'moyahu, that there's no other way to express this oneness. It's not because you're knowing something. It's because God enclosed, the essence of God enclosed himself in this knowledge. And by you understanding the knowledge, that's just a method of connecting your essence with God's essence. And that's why when the Torah says, what is the name of the main book of the 5 books that represents what Torah is, it's called Vayikra, the calling, the connection that's beyond the name, the connection, the essential connection between the caller and the one who's being called, the one who's being called back to the person who's calling, the one who's calling. Yichud nifla she'en yichud k'mayu. Elakiven shatanya sefer Chassidus Chabad. The Tanya is a book of Chassidus, of Chabad. Chabad is about wisdom, so it talks about the intellectual connection. This is the it's just explained by the intellect, but it's deeper than the intellect. It's the essence of what's beyond the intellect. Like the head, beyond knowing and beyond being able to know. Rebbe continues with this idea. I just want to finish off about this. Is not just this idea is also in the idea of how one studies the oral parts of Torah. That the oral parts of Torah there's the studying of the Talmud, the intellect, the arguments, the pilpul. But what do we know? Where's the real essence of Torah is in halacha. That's why it says, where did God rest after the destruction of the temple? Is in the halacha. And the halacha is brought down, the idea, for instance, that says by King David, because he had bittul, because he had self-nullification, it says havaya imay. All those who challenged David had ego. Achitofel, that we learned about in the Gemara, Doeg, all these people try to get thought that David is lacking in his havaya imay, that God is with him. But he never was lacking that, no matter what he went through. Because he had humility to God, he made mistakes. But he never lost his humility. He never had an ego to God. And because of that, Havaya Imay, God was always with him. And that idea that God is always with him is the idea of Vayikra. It's not about the understanding, the knowledge, who knows how to argue better. The idea of knowing the laws doesn't come from who knows how to argue better. It's a certain deep connection that you're so connected that therefore you know what the law is. It means when you have a question like, is the house of Hillel right or the house of Shammai right? Why is the house of Hillel right? Because they had bittul. They had humility. And therefore, they were able to get to the essence of the law, even though you could argue it this way and argue it that way. Okay. Now, the Rebbe let's just finish off with the Rebbe's a parting message of this idea. Vayikra He, the lesson to us is, a person must know, Vayikra. This idea that there's the calling, essential calling, exists. Kriya mitzad etzem, and it's a calling that the essence is calling to every single individual Jew. It's not even hinted in any kind of letter or indication of who's calling. Not even, surely not a name. The essence of God calls every single Jewish person. And therefore, because, like we said, when the essence of the Father calls the Son, or vice versa, it penetrates our essence. You don't have to, you may say, well, maybe God's not calling me, right? I've done this, I've done that. I don't deserve this connection. But it's not about the deserving. I feel the gam lamata is it penetrates the person below. Shekol echad misrael. Notwithstanding on Mamadi Matzavi, where that person is standing in his or her situation. I feel even if you've reached a situation that you can't even call yourself a Jew. Shemei Kvoidish Marchami Adver Mechtav Lachgiz Yud Bistamas Shekin Yechanu Loi K'Moishehu Shem Shehu In Shagila Yehu Davar Mailim. The idea of a person is called by Israel, whatever, it's reaching out to the level of the heart, even the most deepest level of a Jew. Let's just continue. V'kriya zu, and a person gets this calling. Payela Seinin the Adam Ki Yakrim Ken Carbon. What does it awaken within the person? The ability for the person to respond to that calling and to be able to give the carbon, their own sacrifice, the mikem, the essence. You make yourself a spiritual sacrifice to God. Notwithstanding of your situation or your individual situation. If you're a behema like we learned, or you're a bakar, or you're tzayin, the different levels of your animal soul. You're giving all of yourself, whether you're the ox or the sheep or the nesher or the bird, whatever it is, you're giving it all to God. You're not just giving a part to Hashem. I'm leaving a little bit of my ox or my sheep for my personal things. He gives, he's all in for God. And what enables the person to do that? Because God calls your essence. And when God calls your essence, it enables for us to respond, to give our essence. And therefore the Rebbe finishes off, this becomes a pleasant, so to say, reach smell for God. Nachas ruach, it gives pleasure to God. Lefanai shamarti v'nasir tzayni, I've said and you've done. Lefanai daifka, all the way to me, to the essence. Shemagia lefnei mikol anyanim, beyond all ideas. Lefnai lefnim, in the inner parts of God. Lefnei avai, even higher than the name. Misham nimshach lamata, and therefore brings down. B'chol prati nyani olam ad l'sug adayim shu yeser tachton, and penetrates even to the most lifeless part of creation. From this will come to the promise of the prophets. That when Mashiach comes, the presence of God is going to be revealed. And everyone's going to see. That everything is the word of God. Even the flesh of the person. Even if you don't understand it, the parts of you that doesn't have understanding, Yiralikus is going to see godliness. Not just to see it in a way of visual. You become one, an essential one with what you're seeing. With the coming of the redemption, with the righteous Mashiach, speed in that time. And I want to thank everyone and wish everyone a good Shabbos. And thank you for joining. And we'll see you guys Hashem next week before Pesach. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.